Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for our webinar on counting youth in the 2017 Unsheltered Point in Time Count. My name is Jordan Layton. I'm a research analyst at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. This is our second in a series of webinars on the 2017 Point in Time Counts, and this one will focus on counting homeless youth. We at the National Alliance to End Homelessness are a leading national voice on the issue of homelessness. I'm part of the Homelessness Research Institute, HRI, which is the research and education arm of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Okay, so you are welcome to please submit your questions as we go along. There's a questions box in the control panel in the webinar software. So please submit any questions. And if you have a particular presenter in mind for your question, please just indicate that when you send it in. And then afterwards, after the presentations, we'll get to as many questions as we can. Also, if you, as you listen, if you think of thoughts or suggestions about what has worked for you and your community, about what's being discussed, then you're also welcome to submit that through the questions as well. And I'll keep an eye on those and afterwards recap some of those as well. You're welcome to put your community if you want. Okay, so besides that, the lines are muted. So please just use the questions box, and we plan on posting the webinar on the website within about a week or so. So our agenda today, we have some fantastic presenters who have worked with many communities across the country to develop effective strategies for counting youth. First, we'll have a presentation by Beth Horwitz and Jennifer Vitus from Chapin Hall, the Voices of Youth Count Initiative. And after them, we will hear from Peter Connery and Samantha Green from Applied Survey Research. Following that, like I said, we'll have some time to get to as many of your questions as we can. Okay, so without further ado, let's turn the time over to Beth and Jennifer.
Great. Thanks, Jordan. Thank you for the introductions, and a special thanks to NAEH for hosting this webinar. We welcome this opportunity to share what we've learned from conducting youth counts this year and to provide some guidance, tools, and resources to all communities seeking to conduct a more accurate count of homeless youth during this very important baseline year for establishing your counts of homeless youth inside the HUD PIT count. My name is Jennifer Vitus, and I am a policy fellow with Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago and a member of the Voices of Youth Count team. Voices of Youth Count is a national policy research initiative launched by Chapin Hall of Chicago. It's designed to fill the critical gaps we know still exist in our nation's knowledge about the number and experiences of runaway and unaccompanied homeless youth. It's our goal to put the best data possible and a set of strategies into the hands of policymakers, service providers, funders, and advocates who are working in communities across this country to prevent and end youth homelessness. To that end, Voices of Youth Count is more than a count. It's actually a multi-pronged initiative that includes an array of research and policy activities, including a set of in-depth qualitative interviews with youth experiencing homelessness, a comprehensive review of the evidence of what works, analysis of state, local, and federal policies impacting homeless youth, provider surveys, and a national household survey. But today, we'll be focusing on one component of this comprehensive initiative, and that's our youth counts. And while we know that counts are are only one source of data about youth experiencing homelessness. They are an important source of data and provide a valuable opportunity to engage and empower youth and community in ways that can really catalyze relationships and create new energy that leads to action far beyond the count. So today we'll share some information about our methods inside the Voices of Youth Count initiative, highlight some key elements of our count experience, and point you to some places where you can find tools and resources to learn more and to hopefully use to support you in your planning for the count in January. We drew upon the important work and all the great learning that has come from the field and other communities that have conducted youth counts over time, many of which may be on the line with us now, I hope, and developed a youth center methodology that was consistently implemented with the help of our good research partners at Applied Survey Research, who you'll hear from next, across our 22 voice partner communities. And what you're seeing on this slide is a map of those partner communities. They included, or include, because they're still working with us, urban, suburban, and rural communities, communities ranging from those with little to no infrastructure to address youth homelessness to communities with extensive provider networks that are working together to support homeless youth. Some of our partners have had experience and have done their own youth counts before using youth-focused methodologies, and others were learning with us by conducting those counts for the first time. The Voices of Youth counts were conducted during the summer throughout the months of June, July, and August over a period of 24 hours in each community. We counted youth between the ages of 13 through 25 years old who were both experiencing housing instability, including being doubled up, couch surfing, staying in hotels, motels, or involved in the sex trade, as well as youth experiencing homelessness. That included sleeping outdoors, in cars, in shelters, and other temporary housing programs. So with that little bit of context, I'm going to turn this over now to Beth Horowitz, who is a senior site coordinator with Voices of Youth Count, and worked closely with many of our 22 sites to conduct the youth counts, and has really helped shape and develop many of the tools and resources that we are sharing with all of you via a toolkit that we've put together that's now available on our website.
Thanks, Jennifer. Our youth counts were planned and conducted by a broad coalition of providers and community stakeholders who work with and support youth experiencing homelessness. Youth experiencing homelessness are not always connected to homeless service providers, and we wanted to make sure that we were engaging the broad network of people that youth turn to when they need help. We needed to have this diversity of stakeholders if we were going to get connected to all of the different groups of youth experiencing homelessness in the community. For many of our partners, planning the youth count was a catalyst for convening a cross-section of stakeholders who may not always talk to each other, but need to work together to begin coordinating and collaborating to end youth homelessness. In each community, the stakeholders assembled were different, reflecting the diversity of youth experience and the realities of the community's infrastructure, but included a combination of the groups listed on the slide. In each community, we had a lead agency or two who took on the primary responsibility of not just being our thought partners in planning the youth count, but also of bringing together the many other people who needed to be involved in the planning process. The broad coalition of stakeholders helped us connect with the diversity of youth experiencing homelessness and housing instability in the community. Youth were the experts leading our counts. We wanted to make sure it was possible for youth to be fully involved in the planning and implementation of the count. So for all activities, We paid youth $10 an hour to work for us. Youth participated in focus groups, which I'll talk a bit more about later, to help us figure out where, when, and how to conduct the youth count. We didn't count on every corner, but rather focused our energies on the locations where youth told us that they and their peers spend time. We then hired youth, who we called guides, to conduct the youth count, often hiring many of the same youth who had been in the focus groups. They worked in teams of 2 to 3 guides with 1 to 2 service providers and went to designated places to conduct the count. The guides, working as a team, determined who to count, and they were the ones who conducted the surveys and gathered the data. In many communities, it was the relationships the guides had with other youth in the community that led them to completing the surveys. Our teams would often come back from the count and report that it was because people knew the guides and the areas they were conducting the count that youth were willing to be surveyed. Our youth counts relied on relationships among providers, relationships among youth, and relationships between providers and youth. For the youth counts, we counted in 3 types of places. We conducted a street count using a known locations approach to target the places where we were told youth experiencing homelessness and housing instability spend time. We conducted an organizational count, asking providers who work with youth experiencing homelessness to conduct surveys with the youth they served during the count period. Organizations, including places like shelters and transitional housing programs, but also included drop-in centers, workforce development sites, health centers, and feeding programs, among others. And lastly, we organized come and be counted locations. These were locations where youth could come on the day of the count to complete a survey. Often, they were places where youth already hung out at, like libraries and youth services organizations, but where youth were intentionally asked to come to complete a survey. This was our framework for the youth counts, but in each community, we had to figure out what the youth count would look like. Which brings us to our methodology. As we mentioned, our youth counts were built on relationships. We started each count by engaging stakeholders. They, in turn, helped us engage young people. And then we held focus groups for both providers and youth. During the focus groups, we learned from the local experts, the youth who are experiencing homelessness and the provider system that supports them, about where and how to conduct the youth count. We made maps of the locations, which we called hotspots, where youth experiencing homelessness and housing instability spend time. For each hotspot, we found out when to go, how many youth would be there, and whether there were special considerations, such as providers already working in the area. This information helped us plan our street count. We also learned about the provider sites where youth seek services, which became our organizational count, and talked with youth about where, if at all, to have come and be counted locations. We took all of this information, developed a plan, and then recruited more youth and provider staff and volunteers to conduct the youth count. The youth we'd engaged in the focus groups were often a big help with us. Many of them became invested in the count through the process and both signed up to work and spread the word to their friends. We then held trainings to learn how to conduct the count, both how to do the data collection, but also how to approach people on the street to complete surveys and how to be safe through the whole process. The trainings were usually held the day of or the day before the count, with some communities doing extra training in advance to practice street outreach. And then we held the youth counts, gathering information through both a visual count, in which our street teams made note of perceived information about young people but didn't speak to anyone, and then the brief youth survey, in which the guides approached youth to complete surveys, and provider staff and volunteers completed surveys at organizational locations and come and be counted locations. Our biggest lesson learned from this is that often young people experiencing homelessness are not visibly distinct from their stably housed peers. The survey component was vital for really understanding which of the youth were unstably housed. To close, we wanted to touch on some of the decisions we made because we know that not all youth identify as being homeless and that there can be a stigma with being identified as homeless. When youth were approached to do a survey, they were told that we were doing a survey about the housing experiences of youth ages 13 to 25. Our survey question about housing asked where people slept the night before. We never used the word homeless. When the teams conducted surveys for the street count, they were often approaching youth in groups. We wanted to make sure that all youth had the same experience with the survey, so that if they chose to talk about it afterwards, they would all have been asked the same thing. So even if a youth answered the question about housing in a way that indicated they were likely stably housed, they still got asked all of the subsequent demographic questions. We wanted the process to be the same for everyone. In the subsequent data cleaning process, we've been able to exclude the information of the youth who are stably housed. And lastly, we were very careful about how we told people about the youth count. At times, we used flyers in communities in targeted locations, but we hesitated to post flyers all over the community out of concern that youth would avoid the youth count if they heard it was happening in that way. We were most successful at spreading the word about the youth count through word of mouth and social media. All of what we covered and a lot more information is included in the toolkit that Jennifer mentioned that we released last week. You can learn about how we did each step, our lessons learned, and access to tools we used and refined over the course of the summer by downloading some or all of our toolkit, which is available on the Voices of Youth Count website. We're really interested in learning more about how communities plan to conduct their youth counts and what they learn from using our methods and tools, and would welcome your feedback and questions to voic@chapinhall.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth and Jennifer. Let's turn to our next presentation by Peter Connery and Samantha Green.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank the Alliance for hosting these webinars. We're very committed to sharing what lessons learned from point-in-time counts, focusing on youth and in the general population as well. So we appreciate it. As a little background, Applied Survey Research is a community-based research organization that specializes in community assessments and program evaluation. And we've had a homeless practice within the assessment wing of our organization since 1999. And since that time, we've provided technical assistance to small and large communities throughout California and other parts of the country, doing both general population point-in-time counts, and then beginning in 2005, we started with helping out with youth counts within the point-in-time count efforts, and have since helped about 50 communities throughout the country in that effort. Today, Samantha Green, my colleague, and I will talk to you a little bit from our perspective as technical assistance providers in community research and organizing the point-in-time counts focusing on youth. We'll talk a little bit about the challenges, opportunities, and key elements to conducting a successful youth count. We'll also talk about some leadership and engagement strategies. And then Samantha will talk about planning and outreach and other key areas on conducting a solid youth count. There's a lot of text here. There's a lot of information to kind of push out in a short time, and I apologize for that, but we want to make sure we get it on paper and are able to share with you, and look forward to your questions at the conclusion of the presentation. As many of you have experienced through the years, traditional methods in the general point-in-time counts often miss unaccompanied children and youth, transition-aged youth. One of the lessons we've learned over the years is that timing is critical. So in your discussions and planning efforts, try to determine some of the best times of day. Very commonly, 6 a.m. in the morning at daybreak is not the best time for youth. It's important to recognize that there's a difference in the locations where unaccompanied children and transition-aged youth hang out, and it's distinct from the general population. Beth mentioned this in the Voices of Youth Count effort, and it was critical in that planning effort to determine where those locations were and also the optimal time of day folks were in those locations. Important, just as you're in your general population, to develop diverse strategies that represent different subpopulation groups. There is as much diversity within the youth population as there is with the general population. You need efforts that will represent under 18 unaccompanied children, efforts to represent the transition-aged age group, the 18 through 24, attending school, COE, youth, LGBTQ. There's ethnic subpopulation groups that require unique strategies. There's a double up, as well as differences in urban and rural outreach efforts. So your planning efforts should hopefully represent some of the many layers of youth homelessness. Also really important to integrate your youth count with your general point-in-time count efforts to get the best baseline number and avoid duplication. And then notwithstanding the opportunity that it provides you to reach out to this population and better understand their unique characteristics. It's especially important to integrate the efforts with the transition-aged youth population, because the 18 to 24 youth can float between both the youth groups as well as the older general population groups. As always, and one of the things that has hindered a lot of dedicated youth counts is duplication concerns. And while that's important, that shouldn't get in your way of organizing a dedicated youth count. One of the big challenges we all face in youth count planning is the lack of service networks to tie into, because many communities we work with, especially the medium and small communities, don't have much of an infrastructure. And then the last thing, one of the challenges in this effort is we've seen some communities resist youth count efforts because they felt that their homeless population reporting already had an overwhelming number, and they were concerned about the consequences of finding more and increasing your HUD reporting. But HUD has assured communities throughout the country that it's more important for them to have accurate data, and they understand that a dedicated youth count will naturally evolve into potentially larger numbers. So key elements of a successful youth count: early planning. We've already started now with many of our communities on dedicated youth planning. Make sure that the components complement one another, both the general count and youth, and meet HUD reporting requirements. You need to engage a larger group of community stakeholders. Many faith-based providers need to be included, and folks outside your continuum of care. We very strongly recommend peer participation in the planning and outreach efforts. Develop customized strategies that reflect the diversity of the population, the groups that I mentioned in the previous slide. Make sure that you go out of your comfort zone and outreach, and don't just rely on service-centric locations and youth. And then as you develop your data collection instruments and your outreach strategies, really think about what you're going to do with the data that you collect, not just for the HDX reporting that we have to do, but also the value that this data has in community education and program planning. So in that planning effort, leadership and community engagement and youth engagement are critical. You want to convene a diverse group of providers and individuals who work with youth on a regular basis. Use existing work that's been successful in other communities, and there's a good summary toolkit that Chapin has done a fantastic job with. Make sure that you engage a broad network beyond just school contacts, because the historical data that we've worked with shows us that the majority of the youth that are in this category are in the 18 to 24 range. And as I mentioned, that's an age group that can straddle the adult shelter network as well as the youth networks. Don't forget day service providers as well as the adult shelters. And then also don't forget that there are many youth under 25 that are parenting youth and pregnant. And working with family-oriented providers and pregnancy counseling organizations can help quite a bit. Very important to include youth in the leadership team. Youth are tremendously empowered in many communities, very politically active, and they want to participate in the planning and have much to contribute. Make sure that this leadership reflects the diversity. We like to have, at least one representative from each of the subpopulations we discussed. In many communities, you're gonna be really challenged because there's no infrastructure, no youth providers, which means that you can't give up. You have to just develop alternatives. Start talking to youth and going to places where youth connect to other systems. Some communities, for example, we've known have gone to youth drum circles to recruit folks. So you really need to kind of push the envelope. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Samantha, and she's going to get into some of the more specific details about planning your account.
Great, thanks. So one of the things that we really wanted to talk about was thinking about all of the amazing tools that are out there and how we can use those tools, but also ensure that our youth count fits seamlessly into our general PIT count plan and method. So one of the things that we really want to talk about is the planning process. So knowing in advance how you're going to analyze your data from the time that you begin your planning process through the end. Understand how all of the tools fit into place, how the different outreach strategies will connect with one another, and ensuring that you're playing off of the different strengths of the different components of your point-in-time count across different subpopulations. You also want to think about the potential duplication issues, as Peter mentioned, right? Ensure that you're using a HUD-approved PIT count methodology, that you have data collection instruments that will meet all of your reporting requirements, and that you've discussed the role of HMIS in your point-in-time count. Oftentimes, a number of shelter providers may not be inputting their data in HMIS. Other communities will have 100% HMIS coverage, and so the shelter component may be something that's already covered by your general count process, and so the youth count process won't have to deal with that part of the component. You also want to think about reviewing other key subpopulations and the methods for special outreach that will be done there. In some of the communities that we've worked with, vehicular counts are part of that process, and so understanding the vehicular count is something that the youth count effort needs to target for youth that are living in cars or if that's something that's going to be done by other outreach methods. We always really talk about compensation and feeding youth for while they're participating in the process, recognizing their time and expertise. The data collection forms is a big piece of any planning process, and one of the things that we've really kind of started to learn through this process, while we've been very much dedicated to HUD reporting, is that the youth count offers an opportunity to collect data beyond those HUD reporting categories. So define the population of interest. I know that a number of communities have had their youth count separate from their PIT counts because they've felt the definition was too limiting with the HUD PIT counts. But just because you're participating in the HUD PIT count doesn't mean that you only have to collect data that's going to be reported to HUD. You can collect beyond those definitions using a broader definition of homeless or unstably housed youth, just ensuring that you have a method for getting down to those that are meet the PIT definition and can report on those categories. You also want to ensure that your HUD questions are addressed by the tools that you're using and that you're collecting data that allows you for deduplication. And we recommend that survey instruments take no more than 15 minutes. Close-ended questions usually result in the best data. And again, that deduplication process. The deduplication process really depends on the method and outreach strategies that you'll be using. If you're using a survey-based enumeration, that's pretty simple. Using birth dates and initials can get you a really quite simple process. If you're using an observation-based count, thinking about how can you think about the duplication across the different outreach strategies, both for youth and the general count efforts. Thinking about if it's geography, age, gender, all of those components can help to work through the deduplication process that you'll need to go through at the end of your data analysis. And then develop a quality control process in your planning process. So we use assignment logs and deployment logs, ensuring that the paperwork is labeled complete and legible. And this may sound simple, but it's one of those things that will really help to think about all of the ways that you've done outreach from year to year, how it's changed, who's participated in the process, the leadership team, how they were able to access the community and actually do that outreach that's occurred. Most often we think about youth counts as kind of provider-based outreach, and this is a lot of the work that was done through the Voices of Youth count, and we want to make sure that people are really thinking beyond their shelter counts, right? So using the network of service providers that are out there to think about how you can outreach to youth. Promote the McKinney-Vento staff involvement in your youth recruiting as well as the youth count efforts. Are there ways to engage the schools in data collection, getting surveys out to the community of youth that are unaccompanied and in schools? Also to think about pregnant and parenting youth if they have younger children that are in the school system. There's also the opportunity to count and survey at each provider location. They can refer their youth to other sites where they can be counted if they can't actually participate in the count and survey. They connect people accessing their programs or on their wait list and engage them in the count. So that's something that's happened in many of our communities where we have both our McKinney-Vento liaisons as well as some providers that have wait lists for services who can engage with those that are on their wait list and ensure that they're included in the count, either as guides that are working in the youth count, the street count, or that they're accessing services at a provider location where they can be included. One of the things that often comes up is event-based strategies. We've conducted event-based strategies in some communities, and we found that these are often challenging. Event-based strategies at provider locations are really limited to the youth that are service connected, primarily those youth that are connected at that service site. So it's a great mechanism for getting youth who are already connected to a provider to connect on that day, but just recognize that there are limitations and that you'll have to have other outreach strategies for youth that may be less service connected or service resistant. So street-based outreach, the Voices has kind of some awesome tools that are all there in their toolkit. Phase 2, it's about holding focus groups and identifying how to get out onto the streets to identify where youth may be. So we always go through a mapping process. So we literally stick it on the map. Where are youth? What time of day are they likely to be there? Who are they connected to? Whether that's service providers, community organizations, other youth. And then just always checking to see if there's any subpopulations that are missing from your maps and from your outreach strategies. once you have kind of the plan of where youth are, developing ways to reach those youth, we always recommend the peer-to-peer outreach. It's not always possible, but it's a great way to kind of get connected, ensuring that there's incentives for participating in the process. And again, integrating those events carefully and addressing the duplication issues, whether there's the street-based outreach or the community organization outreach that are happening in similar areas at similar times. So key tips. We always say that engaging non-traditional partners is essential. We want to make sure that we're thinking beyond the COC, thinking beyond our shelter providers, but that really takes time, so start now. Acknowledge and plan for the youth diversity and build flexibility into your recruitment and your data collection process. Ensure that the instruments are reflective of that diversity and the youth that participate in your account and your planning also reflect that diversity. Always protect the safety and comfort of those who are being counted as well as those who are doing the counting. Ensuring that the data that's reported and that it's sent out to the communities in a way that builds trust with the community and that you can build on from year to year. In some communities, we found that just general pit count efforts have led to folks being moved after the count, and that really prohibits trust and participation from year to year. So how can you best protect those that you're trying to include in the count? Again, using those incentives to create participation. We compensate and feed youth for their time and participation, but also ensuring that service providers are compensated and acknowledged for their time, and making sure that they have enough time to plan for their absence during the count. A lot of times it's a number of hours that are requested from them, so making sure that they can plan for that time. It's also essential to circle back and make sure that the point in time data is shared with the local community who helped to collect it. People are always curious about the numbers, how they were analyzed, what it means, so making sure that we get back to those that participated in the count, and then making time for a debrief. So recording what's happened, what the limitations are, what you've learned, what you can improve from year to year, and really documenting that information kind of right after the point in time count, but also a few weeks later once you've had time to process and kind of think about the process more generally and how the different components have rolled out. I'm going to hand it back to Peter for the closing.
Thank you, Samantha. So just to finish up here, obviously those of you who have tried youth counts already know that it's one of the hardest components of a point-in-time count, and it's important to stay positive and keep improving every year. We've been doing it for a lot of years, and we know that you can't count everyone, every youth in your community, but you can improve the quality of your data every year. One of the biggest bits of advice we can give is don't let the goal of perfect get in the way of good. You may not knock it out of the park if you haven't done this before in your first attempt, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't make a big effort and continue the learning process. Very important to think about how you can collect data that you want and will be able to use in your community, but you don't have to collect everything. There's a tendency for everyone in the community to try to get their youth questions answered in the point in time count, and recognize that you have a limited time of engagement and there's a limit to how much data you can collect at a single point in time count exercise. Keep the end game in mind, but remember to stay nimble with your outreach plan and don't give up. Pit counts are a tremendous opportunity for community action, and what we can share from the youth count reporting that we've done over the years since 2005 is that it makes a tremendous impact on community members when they understand the real prevalence of youth homelessness and the living conditions and characteristics that our youth are experiencing, and the potential for their situations getting worse as they age. So really important to think about your dissemination of your results and educate your community as to the characteristics and size of the population so that we can achieve our goal of ending youth homelessness. Thank you very much. If you'd like to ask any questions of Sam or I at Applied Survey Research, we've got our contact information on this slide, and we're more than happy to help with any questions that don't get answered in the webinar Q&A.
All right, thank you. Let me switch slides here. So we've had a few questions that have come in. As far as the recording of the webinar, we usually get that up within a week onto our website, so keep your eye out on our website, endhomelessness.org, as well as in our newsletters, to get those. All right, so let me first ask a question here that has come in to Chapin Hall regarding when you paid youth. Were they paid as employees? Were they contractors or stipend volunteers? How did that work for you, Beth or Jennifer?
Hi, Jordan. I think the best way to characterize it is that they were, we paid stipends as volunteers. They were not employees or formal contractors. We paid them $10 an hour in cash for their time, and they understood that they'd be compensated for all of their time in participating in both the planning and the execution of the count.
Okay, thanks. And this question for you, or really for anybody, how did you approach? You touched on this a bit, but how did you approach outreaching in rural locations, or was that not so much a focus of? How did the outreach effort differ in rural areas? If you want to add anything to what you've already said about rural strategies.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead, Beth.
No, Peter, go ahead. I was going to say that you raised several really effective strategies about you really thinking outside the box and thinking broadly about the organizations and providers of services that come in contact with youth and engaging them in the process. So that includes the faith-based community, libraries, as wide the school system, the folks who have contact with young people and bringing them into the planning process, and also having them help you connect to other youth. In rural communities, really, in many ways, it was the youth who were the most powerful strategy we had for reaching other youth. In rural communities, they were super well networked, knew each other, had ways of reaching each other in real time through social media, and a lot of inside intelligence about where other youth can be found, just in general, but even on the day of the count. So it was important to be flexible. I think Peter made this point, or Sam did, that on the day of the count, about responding to what youth were hearing about where other youth could be found during the enumeration.
Yeah, and just Jenny's points are well taken, and again, in the absence of formal service networks in rural communities, you frequently have to build them yourself. There's usually, a social service advocate that may be with a county or a jurisdiction that has some contacts, but very commonly it requires an effective shoulder tapping system where you engage on the street with youth, develop a rapport, ask questions, develop trust. They share maybe a resource person that they go to. You can then talk to that person, and it's very common in the lack of formal support structures in rural areas that there's a church or sometimes, you know, a grandmother type resource that, you know, gives them a place to sleep and whatever food they may have. And that's your inroad into gaining trust and building an outreach strategy. And that takes time, but it's really important. And once the tap gets turned on with those resources, you'd be surprised at you know, what peels back from your community picture of rural homelessness.
All right, thank you. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is Samantha. I think one of the other pieces to think about is that the mapping kind of strategy that we outlined has to really be changed for rural communities because the locations will change so frequently. So because there's oftentimes not a safe or adequate place for youth to be in the rural communities, that the locations will be different, or that youth will be on private property. So thinking about that outreach in a different way rather than having a stagnant map, but thinking about it as what are the locations where we can start from and who are the people that we can connect with, rather than these are the stagnant locations where we're going to go and conduct our count on the day of the count. I think that the flexibility and being nimble and listening to what's happening and being connected to those youth is really important, and going beyond kind of that map process.
All right, thank you. So a theme of several questions has been about some of the, and as much as you might share about this, any of you, about funding sort of questions, budget sort of questions. Have these counts in places you've gone, do you have any sense of any sort of average budgets or that you've seen? And then also, have you seen any creative ways of compensating youth or compensating people who took surveys? What have you seen as far as the financial picture in these youth counts that you've done? Sorry, that's a little vague.
This is Peter. I can share a few you know, experiences that we've had. Firstly, integrating your youth count with your general point-in-time count is important in that it doesn't, you don't have to look at it as a separate fundraising effort, and it's integrated into the entire allocation for your point-in-time count, whatever that financial source is. Many communities have some private funding. Other communities, more typically we find there's a collaborative funding where the jurisdictions within the continuum, the counties and the jurisdictions have a split financial responsibility for the count. One of the things to, you know, keep in mind on the youth effort is that with peer participation, that there is, you know, the hourly payments that Chapin and we mentioned in our presentations. But if you look at the one-day event, you're not typically looking at an incredibly large number of hours that it takes to pay folks. So you've got your trainings and your day of events, which for us usually last maybe 4 to 6 hours. So you're looking at maybe an average of $50 per person plus training time to get youth involvement. So it's not really more than a few $1,000s to work up those stipends that go to youth. And then what we've frequently found is that when in the fundraising efforts, when funders learn that the purpose of the money will be to fund this particular, component of the PIT count, they tend to sign up more quickly than if it was just an administrative reporting cost expense. And they're much more willing to fund an effort which basically goes to youth who are working to end homelessness from a peer perspective. They're very supportive of that. And then on the last thing you mentioned, Jordan, was, incentives for survey responses. We've worked, across the board with different incentive approaches, and they've ranged in our early days with phone cards to, more recently we do a lot of gift cards for Starbucks and McDonald's or Trader Joe's or CVS or some place that has low-cost goods where, $5 incentives, can go a long way. And then in some communities, we found that they don't really want to give a lot of cash out, and that's unfortunate but understandable. And we found that those communities have had success by giving the participants credit or at service locations for different things that are important to them, like laundry fees or bus passes or extra meals or an extra shopping opportunity through Goodwill or through some other resource. And just as a final comment on that, the stipend incentive approach we have generally found to be significantly cheaper than the event-based efforts that we've worked on.
Jordan, this is Beth Horowitz with Chapin and wanted to add it to the great information Peter shared, which is that for the youth counts, one of the things that we thought was really important with Voices was that having decided that gift cards was going to be our approach, we asked the youth in each community where to buy them. So Peter was sort of mentioning those different locations. It wasn't because we said this is the place to get them, which is why there was the variation, right? In some communities, they said, we want Starbucks. In other communities, they said very clearly, we want McDonald's because that's where you'll get the most for your money. And it varied sort of community by community, and we wanted to make sure that we were getting the gift cards in the places that they wanted. So again, another place where it was the youth who told us where to go for those incentives.
Thanks. Excellent. So let me ask a question here about identifying hotspots. And have you found that there's a good way to go about identifying hotspots, and how early is good to start identifying hotspots? Like, do the hotspots end up changing from when you plan them to the day of the count? So do you have any suggestions about that? This is really for all of you. Yeah, sorry, you have any thoughts on? All right,
yeah.
Beth sounds good.
The toolkit has some great resources that are in there, and they're all methods that we recommend, right? So using focus groups to identify those hotspot locations, using Google Maps because everyone has it and it's effective, and you can use it with service providers that don't actually have to attend a focus group. They can just fill out that form. We've done hotspotting through SurveyMonkey, so having folks just fill out a quick survey about where folks are most likely to be. We found that having the hotspot meetings closest to, as close as you possibly can to count date is really effective. I think one of the challenges is thinking about kind of how can you get all of those hotspots and then develop your plan, and that's always kind of where that time frame gets a little bit wonky. But if you can get it as close to your count date as possible, that's kind of the best way to do it. We recommend kind of no earlier than late December because the weather is really going to change. And I think one of the things that we found is that weather is one of the biggest factors when you're doing your point-in-time count about where people will be, but also thinking about, you know, if there's police activity or if there are any encampments or areas that are around railroads or things like that where people may be cleared from those locations right up to the date of the count. So thinking about mapping those locations, but also being nimble. Communities that have had the most effective outreach are communities that have done hotspotting in late December, early January, but then have had teams kind of go and check those locations closer to the date of the count, and then been nimble enough that when they all gathered for their point-in-time count efforts, if there was any major change, that they could kind of address that in their outreach strategy day of. I would say, you know, just generally speaking, don't lose sight of going through the process of hotspotting because it is effective, and a lot of times those locations will remain stable over long periods of time, particularly in urban areas. But at the same time, building in enough flexibility and enough kind of reiteration and going back through that process close to your pin count that you can be nimble.
And George, if I can add to that a little bit, it's absolutely critical that you think about hot spots in conjunction with hot times, because a hot spot can easily be a not spot if you go there at the wrong time. And it's one of the most frequent feedback items we get is that we went to the right place, but we may not have hit it at the perfect time. So it's super important, as Sam mentioned, that you be nimble enough to, in your planning, to get there at the most opportune times, and then work with the youth to be able to course correct when there are changes right up around the count time, or if there has been a, you know, because of either a weather-related issue or very commonly a code enforcement issue that has, you know, moved the group around. And, you know, the other comment I wanted to make about hotspotting is that we're huge fans of it, not just as it's a window into your community, but it's a tremendous tool in community engagement. The youth love to participate in the hotspotting because we're tapping into their area of expertise, and they have a lot to contribute. So it's a great engagement strategy, and it fires people up. And you just can't substitute that enthusiasm you get from it. But again, unless you put into practice the integration of optimal time planning with your hotspotting, and then additionally try and assign those youth that know those hotspot areas most effectively and customize their assignments, you won't get the full benefit of the effort.
Thanks a lot. Another topic that's come in from a few different places is regarding the involvement of schools, and not only from the COC side, as far as what has been effective for getting schools involved, but also somebody wrote in who is a McKinney-Vento liaison and wants to know how she can help the COC, because she's got a lot of mixed information about what she can do at the school level. So what would you say how have you seen schools involved in this, and how have they been helpful in the counting youth process? If you want to speak to any specifics about that. Chapin Hall, do you have any thoughts on what you've seen with school involvement?
Hi, it was a particular challenge for us. I think you'll hear reported when you talk to people around the country about doing their youth count, so that you know, having the school system and McKinney-Vento liaisons fully engaged in the youth count process can be very challenging. It was challenging for us because we did our counts during the summer. But that said, we did try to make those crucial connections with liaisons who would have relationships with youth that may help us find them during the summertime. I know that, in other jurisdictions and COCs that have invested a lot of time and effort in this, they've been very purposeful about including the school system, in the COC structure and as participants in their committees and working with them year over year in planning the counts so that everybody understands that they have a role in this work on an ongoing basis and over time are able to overcome some of the challenges that we know exist around data sharing and just coordination of time and access to youth.
This is Peter. I can add a little bit more, Jordan. In general, working with the schools is challenging because there's not a lot of provision within their time management and their budget to put an effort into supporting the point-in-time count efforts. So the infrastructure you have to deal with is that you'll have a McKinney-Vento liaison at the County Office of Education level who is your first point of contact. And then that COE liaison typically runs a McKinney-Vento liaison forum among the school districts. And one of the things that you want to do, if possible, is get yourself to that COE school district meeting and make a presentation to see if you can recruit participation in the point-in-time count. And then one of your big challenges at that meeting will be to get the school district liaisons to develop a system where they're contacting their McKinney-Vento student families and asking them what their housing status was on the night of your count. And because that's a HUD requirement, you can't report McKinney-Vento data unless you validate it on the day for the night of the count. So that's where the big challenge comes in. And there's been some successful efforts to do that. And I'll turn the floor over to Samantha, who's got a real positive experience that she can share with the team here.
Yeah, so just a quick plug. So there's been a couple of presentations at the National Alliance conferences about engaging County Office of Education and LEAs in the point-in-time count process. So I know that Michelle Fuller-Halauer from Nevada, she helped to present on some of this at the last conference. They're at an advantage where they have one school district for their entire area, but their engagement process is awesome. And we worked with them previously, and it's a great mechanism for engaging students and families, so unaccompanied youth as well as children and families in the process. And they actually have them, on site fill out surveys and engage through the process. Noemi Macias and I presented at both NN4Y and the National Alliance to talk about efforts that have been done in Santa Cruz County, where those McKinney-Vento liaisons actually go through their full list of youth, contact each of the families, and bring them in for the point-in-time count process. One of the things that I'll say is that if you have a larger COC that's not as connected to the COE, getting connected to the COC is a great way to get the process started. So I know a lot of times COCs aren't engaging with the schools for their point-in-time counts because of the definitional differences, but if you can start that conversation from the ground up, it's a great way to become involved in the process. And oftentimes COCs are reaching out to the schools, so it's great if the schools are reaching out to the COC. Going through the process of the validation is definitely tricky, but when you look at the different categories for where youth are staying, the majority of those youth will be doubled up and they won't apply for the point-in-time count definition. So it's really getting to and trying to figure out a mechanism for outreaching to the families that are unstably housed and most likely to be outside of the shelter system and unsheltered on the night of the count. So what we found that it's going through and looking at the households that have identified as staying in motels or hotels, because that's often unstable, those that have said that they're staying in emergency shelters, because that's sometimes unstable, and then those that have identified as being unsheltered in the McKinney-Vento data.
And then I wanted to just wrap up the COE discussion a little bit with just a recommendation and lesson learned from many communities. And that is that, the data very commonly shows that 3/4 or the majority, 80% is a common figure that we find, are in the 18 through 24 age range. And then of the balance that are, the balance of 20%, we don't have exact numbers, but it's somewhere between 5 and between 5 and 10% are probably in school and unaccompanied. So when you have your efforts in where you want to put your resources into unaccompanied youth count, keep that age distribution in mind in your planning. And one of the very common pratfalls we find in this effort is when continuums over-rely on the school systems to generate data on homeless youth. Again, they could be a great resource and a good inroad into homeless children, but there are challenges, and in your planning efforts, if you have to budget where you're going to put into time, keep in mind what that distribution is.
Thanks. Yeah, we have a comment.
Jordan?
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it's Jennifer from Chapin Hall. I was just going to, while we're talking about, engaging educational systems, it's important to remember to keep post-secondary institutions on your list as well. That so many of these youth are 18 to 24 years old and maybe enrolled in college, in community colleges, and there's information that's collected on FAFSA applications that does give some indication about the housing status of some students, and that there are liaisons on college campuses who may have connections to these youth, and they're an important resource to tap into.
Great, thanks. And I have a comment here from one of our listeners saying that they involved their school truancy officer, who is a part of the COC, and he had homeless school liaisons provide records of school-age youth that were enrolled in school, and as well involved the financial aid officer at a local career center, who was a resource during the count and had count forms and was able to provide witness of those folks being counted. So let's switch topic real quick, because there's a couple other things that I think are important on a different track here. Let me ask this question here. Was there any concerns or strategies around youth counting other youth in their peer group, let's say, and confidentiality concerns about them collecting sensitive information about the other youth? Did that come up as a challenge, or was there any strategizing around that point from any of your locations?
Yeah, this is Beth with Chapin Hall. It actually was a thing we talked about a bunch. So first, all of our surveys, when they were administered, started with a consent language versus a youth count is being done under the guidance and auspices with an IRB. concerned with protection of human subjects. So our survey started with a consent. And in the consent, the sentence was included which said, if you would rather have the team leader, which was one of the service provider staff or volunteers, conduct the survey, they can, right? So we offered to every youth because we were worried that some might be concerned because of the sort of being friends piece. So that was layered in as sort of a caveat that youth could pull on if they didn't want a peer to know the answers. But what I will say is that often that wasn't ever pulled in. Our team leaders completed almost no surveys because youth were fine sharing it. We had teams come back from the youth counts and said things like, yeah, it was awesome. I just did surveys with all of my friends. To which we would say, but isn't that uncomfortable? Was that hard to do? And they said, no, it was awesome. So I think it sort of reminded all of us that some of the questions that we may think and sort of worries about confidentiality maybe are perceived differently or felt differently by young people in their peer groups. So that was sort of, we did account for it and then ultimately didn't actually have it as a problem or concern in most communities.
One of the other things I'll say on this is that when you're asking questions, so for voices, there were not a ton of questions that asked about information about medical history or those components that would be required for a HUD PIT count. And so in our efforts, one of the things that we've done is, while our youth are very much at the center of our outreach, we offer the capability of youth to fill out the surveys themselves and place them in envelopes, particularly if they're under the age of 18, because there is a lot of sensitive information that's required for HUD for these point-in-time counts that's collected on those surveys. Again, it's not used very often. I will say that youth do fill out surveys themselves pretty frequently, but placing them into the envelope and like signing the back side to ensure that it's not opened is rarely used. I would say that in most cases that happens when they're with a provider rather than a peer, and we found that the peer enumeration actually gets kind of more consistent data with what people have kind of a sense of the youth that they're providing services for, because people just feel a little bit more comfortable recognizing and talking about their challenges with people that have similar challenges.
Thanks a lot. Here's, I think, another important question here. How did you approach when there was youth who were, let's say, not connected with a caregiver? Was there resources and information provided in those cases? Also, were there any reports to Child Protective Services? How was that side of counting minor youth approached? Any strategies or thoughts around that? No one wants to take that one, huh?
So it's always, I mean, it's definitely a challenge. I think in California, where we do most of our counts, we're at an advantage where it's not mandated reporting. So I think that's one of the pieces. I think the other component is thinking about, for voices as well as with all of our counts, we always ensure that the teams have a resource list available to them that they can provide to youth in case of an emergency. And engaging providers that are often doing this kind of outreach is really important as well. So having them as guides or team leaders that are going out with our teams for our youth counts has been really important. Most of the youth that are engaged in the process as guides are service connected. A lot of the outreach is going to be done with youth that are already service connected, but at the same time you're going to connect with youth that are not service connected. So having those resource guides, having resource guides that are actually effective and dedicated to the population is also important. So in some communities that we work with, they have a giant, kind of mini phone book of resources, and most of them aren't applicable to youth. So drilling that down and getting it to like a palm flyer that has essential numbers, ways to connect, and ensuring that that is going to be something that's open and available at the time and the date of the point in time count is essential. And then also having those providers that can answer essential questions while they're there in the field if something does arise. And then always letting the teams know that if there's an emergency, if something doesn't feel right, getting back in touch with the deployment center or the meeting location or the folks that are organizing the count, getting them in touch so that they can send out another outreach team, or if there's a true emergency that they can call 911 right away.
Thanks. That's very helpful. Let me direct this one at ASR. Have you found that that it's been effective to have count timing beyond the night of the count, like a multi-day sort of thing? Have you found that that's been applicable in some places? And how did you avoid duplication in that case? I think you touched on this a bit. If there's anything you want to elaborate on that, that's one of the questions.
Yeah, this is Peter. Absolutely, it's important to determine times, the most appropriate times to reflect the diversity of your homeless youth population. And that frequently is at times that are in opposition or, significantly later or earlier than when your general count is. So depending on your overall strategy, if you have a survey-based strategy, your duplication issues can commonly be eliminated by the use of initials and a birthday as a deduplication tool. In strategies where you have a blitz and survey method where you're doing a physical observation followed by a sample survey process, you can do some analysis of common areas that have been reviewed and look at the observational profiling, and then just make liberal adjustments where there's potential duplication. Very commonly, for example, we'll have a general count area that will have enumerated, and it may indicate on our tally sheets that there were 2 persons under 25 who were observed. And then we'll go back in at another time of day with a dedicated peer-oriented youth team, and that team may come up with 20 youth that are under 25. And then in a situation like that, for our official HUD reporting, we subtract the 2 that were found in the general count from the 20 that were found in the youth count, and we report 18 youth as part of our effort.
Thanks. All right, let's do one more. I think most of the rest of these questions have been addressed in other responses. And I apologize if I missed yours. So the last question here, have you noticed or have you seen any strategies that have been effective in partnering with older youth providers, like 18 to 24-year-old populations, and well, in this case, that have they've experienced that they're not so helpful at like child welfare, for example, at helping out with youth 18 to 24. Have you found that engaging child welfare organizations has been effective for those aging out of foster care and getting into this 18 to 24-year-old group? Sorry, that's a little vague. I'm trying to interpret the question. If there is any strategies for engaging with child welfare, I guess is the question here. Yeah, sorry, have any thoughts on that one?
Jordan,
Sure,
this is
okay.
this is actually that's with Chapin Hall, and I think both the question of some of those providers working with the 18 to 24-year-olds and child welfare, I think really gets to the sort of the heart of recognizing that youth are intersecting with lots of different systems and service sectors. So I think particularly, you know, you hear youth homelessness, people may jump to thinking about runaway and homeless youth providers. And what our experience was through Voices is that a lot of the times young people are getting services, because so many of the ones we found were over the age of 18 and over the age of 21. They're getting services from adult, right, those traditional adult providers. In a lot of communities, more of the homeless services capacity is in that adult service sector, and so I think that's why it's sort of really important, particularly as, you know, January's count is the baseline year, is doing that outreach and engagement to all of those providers so that they understand that they may have been previously categorized as an adult provider and that youth are there also. Sometimes homeless youth providers don't think that their youth are getting services from the adult system, and often they are, because that's where there may be a bed to access, and that may be where a youth prefers to get services. In some of the communities, we were able to help sort of reinforce the idea that youth were getting services in that adult system by looking at the at previous HMIS data, right? Looking at what the ages were that people were serving, the different provider communities. So that helped to sort of maybe break apart that myth that youth are only getting services from youth providers. And similarly, it's, you know, I think within the country we've done some good work of messaging and reinforcing the fact that we know that young people who leave the child welfare system sometimes end up in the homeless services system, and so using that and pivoting to that information to help engage them, knowing that while the young person's in the foster care system or child welfare system, they may not be sort of quote unquote within the homeless services population, but that too often that may be coming, and so engaging them. And we did have success in some of the communities, particularly I would say of providers who do aftercare work, tend to be the ones who are maybe sort of both more aware of their youth who have aged out and need support, and who are thinking more about what happens to youth later. And so they may be some of the first champions to turn to who can help them engage the rest of the network of child welfare providers.
Thanks a lot. All right, everyone. Well, that concludes our webinar. We really want to thank Beth and Jennifer and Peter and Samantha. Please check out Voices of Youth Count and Applied Survey Research, their websites, to see the excellent work they've been doing, and the toolkit that Voices of Youth Count put out. And we thank you for attending, and keep your eye out for the recording of the webinar on the website and on our newsletter. Everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Jordan.